Hi, I'm Tom Miggott from Tom Miggott Photography. In our last two episodes we covered the exposure triangle and one of its important components, the ISO. Today we're unveiling another component, the shutter. If you haven't watched the other episode on the exposure triangle and the ISO, I invite you to do so. The camera shutter is there to regulate the time the media is exposed to the light, whether it's a film or a sensor in a digital camera. Digital photography revolution hasn't brought anything new when it comes to the shutter itself, with maybe the exception of the burst mode, which is something we'll cover in a different episode. Shutter speed is expressed usually in fraction of a second, sometimes in second and in rare occasion hundredths of a second. But most DSLRs out there on the market would enable you to take an exposure at 1/8000th of a second, which is extremely quick. However, in some occasions that might not be enough, and then you will need to rely on something such as neutral density filter, which I'll cover in a different episode as well. Let's have a look at the shutter speed scale, and let's start with a value of 1 second. If I wanted to increase my shutter speed by the very next value, I would get half a second. The interval between 1 second and half a second is called a stop, a little bit like the ISO. So then if I increase my half a second by one full stop, I would get a quarter of a second. Increase it again by one stop and I'll get an eighth of a second. Increase it again, 1/15th of a second. And then you understand the logic. Basically, every time you increase your shutter speed by one stop, you're basically reducing the exposure time by half. Same thing in the other way. If you were to reduce the shutter speed by one stop, you would then increase the exposure time by 2. Then you might be asking yourself, what's the best exposure time for me? And just like for the ISO, it all comes down to the situation you're trying to capture. The more available the light is, the shorter the exposure time, and the less available the light is, the longer the exposure time. There is one side effect that can happen when doing a long exposure though, and that is blur. However, I have found in most cases there are only two main root causes for it. The first one being that you hand-holding your camera, which is nearly impossible when doing a long exposure. The second one might just be that you're using a stand or a tripod, but the lens feature, the image stabilization, is turned on. There is much more detail about this on my blog. This is pretty much what I wanted to cover regarding the shutter. In our next episode, we'll talk about the third and final component of our exposure triangle, the aperture. And until next time, this is Tom Miggott saying, if you like it, capture it.